Okay, so I'm doing an intro because we're on the library channel right now. So I just want to mention a couple of things. We want to thank our co-sponsor, the Iowa State Extension, for this event. There are some books over here. If you're interested in checking them out, please do take them into the library and check them out. If you want to take them home, we have lots of handouts. And I'm going to do our little introduction for Rachel Wall. She is the Nutrition and Health Specialist with the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. And after our event, she's going to be available for dial gauge pressure canner lid testing as well. So welcome to Rachel. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. So as she mentioned, I work for Iowa State University Extension, so I know we're here in Iowa City, but we serve all the citizens of Iowa. So our mission in Extension is to share information and research being done with the citizens of the state of Iowa, because we are a land-grant university. So just a little bit about me. I'm a registered dietitian, and I serve 7 counties in eastern Iowa, so I provide nutrition programming for them. And today we're going to be talking about food preservation. But first, if I could just learn a little bit about you, your name, your experience with canning or preserving, or what you hope to learn today. So go ahead.
I'm Jen. I don't have that much experience canning, but I think it's very interesting. I love food and stuff.
Okay.
Trying new ways to, I guess, preserve would be awesome. So it's a new experience.
Wonderful.
My name's Miller, and I have no experience in canning either. It's my first time. And I just wanted to know how it's different from like the Smucker's canning versus like actually canning at home.
Mm-hmm. Okay, wonderful.
I'm Kara. I really just started canning this year because I have a big garden now, and so, but I've only done warm water bath canning, not pressure canning, and I've done some freezing of things too. I just basically want to learn what I specifically want to learn is how to can things so the low acidity things, so I don't have to pickle everything that isn't high acid.
Good. So that's good. You know about the acid. We'll talk about that. So I can tell you've done your research.
I've done a little reading about it, but yeah.
Good. Great.
Yeah, I just major in electrical engineering and journalism, and I think the food preservation is related to the sustainable and kinds of the aspects related to our everyday life. So
great. Wonderful. Good. And before I forget, I'm just going to go over what these handouts are really quick so that you have a little bit of an understanding. So the first was the Words on Wellness, and this is a nutrition newsletter we send out once every month. So if you're interested in getting on the mailing list, I'll pass around a sign-up sheet. But it has a nutrition article, a recipe, and then on the back it has local events related to nutrition that are going on. And then it has a food safety article, and usually it talks about exercise as well. So if you're interested, I'll pass around a sign-up sheet. The next is Recipe Basics. So this just kind of talks about measuring, substitutions, the importance of measuring accurately. So this is a good reference as well. The next sheet is Food Preservation Resources. This with all of the links on there. So we'll talk a lot today about choosing recipes that are from research-based and approved sources. So these would all be good places to go for information. They've been tested and are proven to be safe. So the first is our ISU Extension website. And on there, depending on what kind of preserving you're interested in doing, we have different handouts. So if you're interested in canning vegetables or doing pressure canning, that would be a good handout to download. So those are all free. You can access those from our website. Also, we have a toll-free hotline called Answer Line. So if you have any question you're canning and it doesn't turn out right, or you have a food safety question, or you have a stain in your shirt and you don't know how to get it out, you can call Answer Line for free Monday through Friday, 9 to noon and 1 to 4. It's 1-800-262-3804. And they will answer your question. And you can also email them and they'll respond back as well. And then down here are some of our kind of gold standards for food preservation. The National Center for Home Food Preservation out of the University of Georgia does a lot of testing of these recipes, and they have written the So Easy to Preserve book, and we call that the Bible of food preservation. So that's a really good reference. You can access approved recipes on their website, or you can also purchase their book, So Easy to Preserve, and the library may even have it as well. But that's a great resource if you're going to do a lot of preserving. There's also the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning and the Ball Blue Book. And then that leads me into my next handout. On the bottom there, it talks about the Preserve the Taste of Summer, which is this handout. So if you're really interested in preserving and want to get some hands-on experience, I would highly recommend our Preserve the Taste of Summer program. We have online lessons that you can complete, and then you get to attend a hands-on workshop. So you actually get to can things. We have pressure canning workshops, hot water bath canning workshops. So we have one on pickle making, jams and jellies. What are the other ones here? Salsa making, and freezing goes along with these as well. So if you're interested in getting some hands-on experience and want some practice, this would be great. And then you also get to take the food home with you. And then the final handout is on safely washing produce. So you're going to be handling a lot of produce while you're preserving, so it's important that it's safe to eat. And especially with some of the recent cyclospore outbreaks and other food safety incidents, it's important that it's handled very carefully. So making sure you give your produce a shower and not a bath. So you want to rinse it off, get rid of the contamination. You don't want to let it sit in the contamination. So that's that as well. Okay, so any questions on those? Okay, I'll pass out the sign-up sheet. If you would like to sign up for the WOW newsletter, you can just put your name and your email address on there. So tonight we're kind of going to talk about three main things: canning, freezing, and dehydrating, how we can do each of those safely. We'll also talk a lot about acid versus low acid foods. So the acidity of the food is going to determine what type of canning we do, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then we've mentioned a couple of the approved resources that we have for food preservation as well. So today's class is kind of just meant to give you a basics of food preservation. So we're not going to go in as much detail as the Preserve the Taste of Summer, but just kind of to highlight how where you can get good sources of information and how you can do this on your own. So first we're going to start off with canning. So when you're canning, you're creating a vacuum in the jar. So air is forced out, creates an anaerobic environment in there to limit the amount of bacterial growth. It also destroys harmful microorganisms, and it inactivates enzymes. So enzymes are parts of plants that cause changes in color, flavor, texture. So by preserving them while we're canning, this is going to help delay some of that enzyme activity that could be occurring. So when we're canning, it's important to use good quality produce because if you're using things that aren't up to at peak freshness and aren't at their best quality, they're not going to last as well, and they're going to be preserved in the manner that you started with. So you want to use high quality produce. Make sure that you've cleaned and washed it as well. And while you're canning, this food is going to be heated to a high enough temperature to destroy microorganisms and inactivate some of those enzymes we talked about. So the air is forced out, and our goal is to form a vacuum seal. So that means that there's air that's not going to be able to enter the jar. So this vacuum seal is important for several reasons. It's going to hold the lid onto the jar. So I'm going to pass around some different products. We have some salsa here that we've done. These are carrots. And then we also have pickled carrots. And then this is, what do you think this is? It's hard to tell. It's actually chicken. So this one, we'll talk a little bit about headspace. We left too much headspace, which is between the top of the food and the top of the jar. but you can preserve meat as well, which we'll talk about. But you'll notice that the lid stays, hello, help yourself to some handouts.
Oh, cool.
The lid stays on the jar because of the vacuum seal that's been formed. Also, it allows the food to not be contaminated, and you're not going to dry out the food because you've got the vacuum seal on there and the air is not able to enter. So we've got two types of approved canning methods, hot water bath canning and pressure canning. So depending on the acidity of the food will determine what type of canner we're going to use. So high acid foods can be processed safely in a hot water bath canner. So this is going to be most fruits except for figs and Asian pears. All other fruits are going to have enough acid in them to be safely processed in this. Tomatoes need to be acidified, and this can be done either with 5% vinegar. You can also use citric acid, but it needs to be acidified because you can't, depending on the variety of the tomato, will determine the acidity content. So this is just kind of a safety measure in place. And then also foods to which large amounts of acid have been added to them. So pickles, salsa, those sauerkraut, those kinds of things can be safely processed because they have a large amount of acid added to them. So high acid foods have a pH of 4.6 or lower. Now our low acid foods are going to be most our vegetables, meats, poultry, and seafood, so like our chicken would fall in that category. And then if you have any mixture of high and low acid foods, so if you're going to have spaghetti sauce or some kind of soup, those would all need to be processed in a pressure canner. So this is an example of a boiling water bath canner. And so the water is going to boil at 212 degrees if you're at sea level. And at this temperature for the high acid foods, there's going to be enough heat to destroy the microorganisms. Pressure canning, when you're under pressure, it's going to allow the temperature to get higher, so it gets up to 240 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's going to be hot enough to kill some of those harmful bacteria. So that's why we need to use it for those foods that don't have a lot of acid in them. So as I mentioned, in the pressure canner, you're able to increase the temperature because of the pressure. What about altitude? Altitude can impact the temperature at which water boils. So if you are, for every 1,000 feet that you're above sea level, the boiling point of water is going to decrease by 2 degrees. So if you're canning in a location that's above sea level, you need to take this into consideration. So if you're using high acid foods, you're going to adjust the processing time. So for high acid foods, we're going to be using a hot water bath canner, and you'll increase the time that they're processed. If you're using a pressure canner for low acid foods, you're going to increase the pressure, which will in turn increase the temperature. So again, increased time in the canner. For pressure canning, there's two kinds of canners, a dial gauge canner and a weighted gauge canner, which we'll talk about. But if you're using a dial gauge, you want to increase according to those recommendations. And a weighted gauge, you're just going to increase to 15 pounds of pressure. So we are fortunate. The shaded counties in the southeast portion of the state do not need to adjust for altitude because we are less than 1,000 feet above sea level. However, the rest of the state is between 1,000 and 2,000 feet, so they would need to adjust for altitude. Who's heard of botulism? Sound familiar? Okay. So why are we so worried about it, and what is it exactly? So Clostridium botulinum, or C. botulinum, forms protective heat-resistant spores. And these aren't destroyed at normal temperatures like you would be able to achieve in a boiling water bath canner. And the symptoms that go along with botulism are very serious. So you'll become very sick, kind of have some of the symptoms similar to other foodborne illnesses. upset stomach, blurred vision. It can result in paralysis and even death. So it's very serious, and that's why we use the pressure canner for low acid foods. So in acid environments, like in our fruits and our salsas and other mixtures that have a lot of acid in it, these spores aren't going to be able to germinate. But in a low acid environment, such as our vegetables and our meats and our mixtures of foods, they will be able to. So that's why we need to reach a higher temperature with them. And that's achieved in the pressure canner. So canned products have a lot of favorable environments, especially if you're working with a low acid food. You've got low acid, there's no air, and you've also got a lot of moisture, and it's within that temperature danger zone we refer to, so between 40 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So this kind of creates the ideal environment for these spores to germinate. And they can form a toxin which, when ingested, can be deadly. So that's why we want to take extra caution when we're working with those low acid foods. So when you're canning, you're going to have some equipment. We'll talk about the jars and the lids that you use. We've talked a little bit about what kind of canner you should use. And then we'll also talk about the stovetop you use, because that can make a difference in how your product turns out. So here we have an example of a boiling water bath canner. So really, anything, your pressure canner can be used also as a boiling water bath canner. It just needs to be something that's large enough to hold the jars and can have 1 to 2 inches of boiling water on top of the jars, along with another 1 to 2 inches of airspace, as you can see in the picture. Also, the jars need to be off the bottom of the canner. They shouldn't be set on the bottom because it's really hot and they can break and shatter. So you can use a rack like this one to put your jars in. You can also make your own rack to put on the bottom out of the rings from the canning jars. So this is something you can make on your own. You don't have to buy any special equipment. So you have your rack there. You need to have enough water to cover the jars, 1 to 2 inches, and then enough room for headspace as well. So you could use, if you have a really large stock pot, or again, a pressure canner can also be used. And these are, I think these run for like $20 to $30 at Hy-Vee, so they're not extremely expensive. Pressure canners are a little more complex than a hot water bath canner. So you can either have a dial gauge pressure canner or a weighted gauge pressure canner. So here is a weighted gauge. So this will rock or jiggle when it's at the correct pressure. So the recipe will call for 5 pounds of pressure or 10 pounds, so you add 1 weight, or 15 pounds, so you'll add another weight. So I'll pass this around so you can see what those look like. So if you're using a weighted gauge, it should rock to jiggle about 4 times per minute, and that will signify that it's at the correct pressure. A dial gauge has numbers on it, so from 0 to about 20 usually, and it will tell you when it's at that pressure. Several things to think about. You also need to make sure the jars aren't sitting on the bottom of the canner. So these usually come with a rack to sit on the bottom, so the jars aren't sitting on the bottom there. So just like with a hot water bath canner, you're going to want to fill it with water. Then to build up the pressure, you need to put the lid on and let the steam vent for 10 minutes. So you're going to see a steady stream of steam come out for 10 minutes. After that, you can put the weight on, and then it will start to build the pressure. And once it starts to rock that 3 to 4 times per minute, then you know it's at adequate pressure. And that's when you can start timing. So that's another important thing to remember. With all of these, there'll be processing times, and you need to make sure it's up to the correct pressure before you actually start timing. So you can't just start the timer when you put the jars in. Let's see, I think that's all on the pressure canner. So there is a difference between pressure canners and pressure cookers. A pressure canner needs to be large enough to hold at least 4 quart-sized jars. So if you're using something with smaller volume, that's not recommended. It can become too hot. The jars can shatter and break. So make sure if you're processing and it calls for a pressure canner, that you're using a pressure canner and not a pressure cooker. What about the cooktop that you use? The ideal stove to use is a gas stove because you can control the heat easiest. However, those aren't quite as popular, and smooth tops have become very popular. If you're going to use a smooth top, it's recommended to check with your manufacturer and see if it's been tested for canning, because a lot of the smooth tops can become, once you have the heat on, they have an automatic shutoff, so if they get too hot, then they'll just turn off. And while we're canning, it's really important that there's constant heat under there, and that if you're in a pressure canner, the water is continuously boiling, or if you have hot water bath canner, if you're in a pressure canner, that it maintains that constant pressure. If it stops boiling or the pressure decreases, you need to stop and start the process all over again. So it's really important that we can maintain that constant heat and that the heat radiates across the entire bottom of the canner. So if you do have a flat top, you want to check with the manufacturer because, again, they can automatically shut off. And also, you have to be careful because you're going to be sliding the canner around and you don't want to scratch your cooktop. So that's another thing to think about. So each recipe has a processing time on it, and these are determined by research. So all of these recipes, as I said, have been tested in a lab to make sure that all parts of the food product have reached the correct temperature for the correct amount of time. And they test it to reach the coldest part of the jar. And there's many factors that can affect this. So the size of the food, the density, the size of the jar, if there's any liquid in the canned product, these all can have an impact. So you'll notice for quarts and pints, there's different processing times because of the different sizes. Yeah.
It's from a couple slides back, but did you say pressure canners you have to use a quart size, or you have to use quart, or at least, it just has to be big enough to hold 4 quart-sized jars. But you could use pints.
Yes, so the question was about pressure canners and the size of jars. Yes, you can put pint-sized jars in here. It just depends on what the recipe has been tested for. So, good question. But essentially, just making sure that you're not using a pressure cooker is the important thing to remember. Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Nope, that's okay. So these are unacceptable methods of canning. So a lot of these have become popular through social media and Pinterest and other forms, but they haven't been proven safe, and they can actually be harmful. So we don't suggest any of these. So we wouldn't recommend using boiling water bath canner for low acid foods. So if I just had carrots that I didn't acidify, I would not want to put them in a boiling water bath canner. Oven canning. This one has become very popular. I've gotten lots of questions about this. It's not safe because if you have any changes in fluctuations in the temperature, the jars can shatter and break, and they could explode on you, which would not be good. Also, ovens have dry heat, whereas when we're using a water bath canner or a pressure canner, we have moist heat. So think about a 350-degree oven. You can stick your arm in there, and you're fine. You would never want to stick your arm, though, into a pot of boiling water. So with the moist heat, it's able to penetrate the jars a lot better, whereas the dry heat is not. So the food isn't going to be heated to a high enough temperature. Open kettle canning. So this is where you just cook the food, pour it in the jars, put the lid on, and call it good. So we don't recommend that. Canning recipes will tell you often to bake the product or cook the product for a certain amount of time, and then fill the jars, and then place the jars into the canner. And we'll talk about that in a little bit later on. But you don't want to just pour the product in, put the lid on, and stick it in the shelf. You should not can in the microwave or the dishwasher. And we also, I don't know why that would be a good idea anyway, but we We don't suggest it. And you also don't want to seal jams and jellies with paraffin. So this is an older practice, but it's with new research and new recommendations, it's not recommended. Also, any recipe from before 1988 is not recommended. So all recipes should be developed within the past 25 years. So make sure you look at the date of when it was dated. And we only want to use USDA approved and tested recipes. So from the resource sheet, those are all going to be safe recipes to use. But if you have a recipe from your great aunt that she made up and it hasn't been tested, we would not recommend using it because we don't know if there's enough acid in there to properly acidify the food. We don't know how the processing time has been tested. So just to keep yourself safe and those that you serve, make sure that it's a tested recipe. Okay, so there's several types of packing for canning. So you can do a raw pack. This means, oh yes.
What's a paraffin?
Oh, good question. So the question is, what is paraffin? And it's kind of like a wax. It's a white wax that was used to place around the jars, and then the lids were placed on there, and they kind of formed a seal, quote unquote. But it wasn't considered completely safe. So good question. So we have raw pack and hot pack. So raw pack is where you just place raw food into the jars, and then you're going to cover it with boiling hot water. And then with the raw pack, you're going to want to make sure that the jars have been heated before you put the food in there and before you put them in the canner. So let's say we're going to do raw pack carrots. So while I'm cutting up the carrots, I'm going to put the jars in some water that's 140 degrees Fahrenheit, along with the lids and the screw bands. So you want to make sure that the jars are heated so that when we put them into the boiling hot water, they're not going to shatter and it's not a huge temperature fluctuation. If you're doing a hot pack where you're putting hot foods into the jars should be 180 degrees, heated in water that's 180 degrees before the hot food is put in there. So we're going to heat the food and then put it into the jars. This isn't going to be packed quite as tightly. One of the advantages of hot packing foods is that while you're cooking it, some of the air from the food escapes so that it doesn't float in the jar. If you put raw food into the jar, there's still some air in the food product so that it will float sometimes after you're done processing it. And then if you have too much headspace, that food can dry out and discolor on the top. So one of the advantages of hot packing food. So when you're filling the food into the jars, there's several things to think about. First, it helps if you have just buy a little kit that has a funnel in it. So this is a home canning kit you can buy. And it has some handy tools. So one is a funnel. So this helps you get all of the food in the jar so you can pour your jam or whatever product, salsa, in here. After you get the food in, you need to check for any air bubbles. So you want to make sure that you don't have any air bubbles because that can influence how much headspace you have. So you want to use something that's plastic or won't scratch the sides of the jar. So we don't recommend using metal knives to release the air bubbles because that can temper the jars and cause them to crack and break. So you want to go around the outside of the jar and then also through the middle to release any air bubbles. Then you want to measure the headspace. So the headspace is the distance between the top of the food product and the top of the jar. And this tool is really handy because it has it broken down in 1/4 inch increments. So if I'm making jelly, so I'm going to need 1/4 inch headspace. So you just place this on the rim of the jar. Or if I had corn, I would need 1 inch, so I can just place it like this. So I'll pass that around so you can see what that looks like. But those are really handy. And then you want to wipe the rim of the jar so that there's no food product on there because that can interfere with forming a good seal. So the correct amount of headspace is important. If you have too little headspace, the food can bubble out while it's processing, and the jar is not going to seal well because there's food product and debris in the way. If you have too much headspace, the food can discolor because you've got the air there that's in contact with the food, and the jar may not seal properly. So it's important that you measure the headspace correctly and have the correct amount. So these are some pictures showing how to fill the jars before you place them in the canner. So again, you want to put the lids and the jars in warm water, so 140 for raw pack, 180 for hot pack. This is a magnetic wand so that you don't have to touch any of the lids and you don't contaminate any of them. So you just use this and then you can put it on top of the jar. So these are really handy. And then after you've placed that on top of the jar, you're going to put the band on until it's fingertip tight. So you don't need to, just need to give it a little tight. You don't need to keep screwing it and screwing it on, just till it's fingertip tight. And then you're going to use, this is really helpful to hold the jars so that you don't have to put your hand into the boiling water. Just use these. And you want to make sure, I think I have pictures on the next slide. Yes, so while you're putting the jars in the canner, you want to make sure that you don't tip the jars at all because that can interfere with forming the seal. So just place it into the canner, and then once you've got all your jars in, you can lower it down into the rack. Then you want to make sure that the water starts to boil, and then you start your timer. Then after, so let's say we're making a product and it calls for 10 minutes of processing. So we'll make sure the water boils for 10 minutes. Then after the 10 minutes, we can turn the heat off. We can take the canner off of the heat, and we need to wait 5 minutes. So this 5 minutes is included, is considered part of the time for the jar to process. So we'll wait 5 minutes, and then we can take the food out. So again, make sure you have the stiff arm, as we call it, so you don't tilt the jar at all, which is really hard to do because there's water on top and you want to get the water off, but that's going to evaporate, so don't worry about that. And then you want to make sure you have a towel down so that you don't burn your countertop and the jars don't crack. And then the jars need to be left undisturbed for 12 to 24 hours. If you do happen to move them, they need to go in the refrigerator and they need to be eaten within 7 days. So make sure that the jars that you let them sit for 12 to 24 hours. Oops. Okay, so again, make sure you're using an up-to-date tested recipe from 1988 or more recent. After you're done processing, you don't want to retighten the screw band on top. So you're going to leave this alone for the 12 to 24 hours while it's cooling. Let them cool, and then you actually want to take the screw bands off before you store the product. And these can be reused, so these are multiple use. The lids are one-time use, so these can only be used once. And the reason you want to take the screw bands off is because they can rust onto the product and then, or onto the jar, and then they can become really hard to come off. So you want to take those off before you're storing them. And you'll often hear a popping sound as the jars cool. So how do you know if you have a good seal? One indication is the popping sound that you'll hear. You can also tap on the lid with a spoon, and if it sounds, so this sounds really dull, so we can tell it's not sealed well. And you can also hold it at eye level. So some of those jars you can hold and you can see that there's a slight concave in the lid. It may be hard to tell right now because the screw bands are on, but that's another good indication that there's been a seal that's been formed. Where should you put your canned goods? It's recommended to store them in a cool, dry, dark place. So a cellar or a basement is good, or in a cupboard. Someplace that's not going to have a lot of temperature extremes, so if it's not something that's not really hot and then gets really cold. As I mentioned, you want to take the screw bands off. You want to label and date the products. Especially if you're doing a lot of canning, it's easy to get them confused. So you want to label and date it. We recommend using canned goods within 1 year that are processed at home, and then store them. So now you guys need to tell me, for these different food products, if you would put it if it would be safe to do in a pressure canner or a hot water bath canner. So we've got cucumbers, but these are going to be turned into pickles. And then we have apples. What will we do? Yep, a hot water bath. So these are going to be considered high acid foods because we're adding acid to the cucumbers. Boiling water bath, good. Green beans and carrots. Yes, those would be in a pressure canner, good. Those are low acid foods. What about meat? So it looks like we've got some beef and fish. Good, pressure canner. And we have peaches and salsa. So the salsa has been acidified. Yep, a boiling water bath. Good. That might be. And then this is a mixture. So we've got some meat and vegetables, tomatoes. Yes, pressure canner. Good. Any questions about canning?
Well, yeah, I do. I mean, I can wait, but I just wanted like advice on like if you're buying a pressure canner, like price range, or if you have any specific recommendations about what to look for.
Okay. So the question was about what type of pressure canner to purchase. I guess we don't have any that we can endorse really,
Yeah.
but it depends on.
To look for.
Yes. So I would recommend if you're going to purchase one to, depending on what you're more comfortable with. So some people prefer to have the weighted gauge because they don't have to get it tested. If you have a dial gauge canner, we recommend they get tested once a year to make sure that the dial is recording it correctly. However, some people are more comfortable with the dial gauge because it can actually tell you what it's at, whereas the weighted gauge you have to listen, and that makes people nervous sometimes if they're not as comfortable with that. So depending on what type of canning or what you're more comfortable with. Otherwise, they're all pretty standard. I mean,
Like you wouldn't have, because I've looked at them and they range anywhere from like $50 to $300. So I didn't know, like, is a $50 one just as good as a $300 one? Or?
I guess most of the ones I've seen run about like 150, 160. Yeah. And another thing you could do, I would recommend calling our answer line, and they could probably give you a better recommendation for how much canning you're doing and what type of canning you're going to be doing. So that 1-800 number, they would be a good reference. Good question. Did you have a question?
Oh yeah, just a clarification. So recently I canned some green beans
Okay.
in boiling water bath, but I didn't actually can them, I pickled them.
Oh, okay.
So I added my own acid and that compensates.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes, so the question was about green beans, and she had pickled them, so is that safe to do in a hot water bath canner? And the answer is yes. So if you properly acidified them and the vinegar, or what did you use? Did you use vinegar or?
We used white wine vinegar.
Okay, so as long, most of the recipes specify that it should be 5% acidity. So if it was the correct acidity and you're following a standardized recipe from USDA, then yes, that was fine. Yep, good question. Any other questions about canning? Okay, next is freezing. So with freezing, this is going to prevent the growth of microorganisms and also slow enzymatic activity. And it was developed in the 1920s. Has anyone heard of bird's eye frozen vegetables? Probably they're available in your grocery store. So they developed this quick freeze process. So freezing foods really quickly to prevent large ice crystals from forming. So there's 4 main factors that can affect the quality of frozen food products. The enzymes, which we talked about earlier, so those things in the food that can change the texture and the taste and the flavor and the color. The air inside a freezer is very dry, and so that's going to dry out your food product. Ice crystals, and then also evaporation of moisture. So we're going to try to slow down or control these things as much as possible to maintain a high quality product. So freezing by itself does not stop enzyme activity. It only slows it down. So for fruits, meats, and grain products, their enzymes really don't change the quality of the food that much while it's frozen. However, vegetables are susceptible to changes from their enzymes. So it's important that we blanch vegetables, and we'll talk about that process before we freeze them, or else their quality is going to be not as good. So air, as we all know, we've cut apples before, bananas, and once they become in contact with air, they oxidize, turn brown. So we want to prevent that from happening while the food is in the freezer. So we want to limit the amount of food the air that comes in contact with the food. Also, air can deteriorate the flavor in fats and oils, and promotes this freezer burn that you may have seen before. So we want to limit the amount of air that's exposed to the food. We also want to limit the development of ice crystals. Ice crystals can disrupt the cell wall of the food product, and they can become larger, make the product watery, and the quality poor. So if we freeze the food quickly and at 0 degrees or lower, that's going to promote fast freezing and limit the amount of ice crystals that are formed. So constantly fluctuating the temperature, opening the freezer door a lot, is going to cause more ice crystals to form. And if you could even freeze the food at lower temperatures, so -10 degrees Fahrenheit, that's going to be even better than at 0 degrees. Also, products should be wrapped properly. So they have freezer paper that you can purchase in the stores, and it will tell you how to wrap the different products on there. Also, containers that are freezer approved, and plastic bags. These are all going to be recommended to get the freezer type to help limit the amount of evaporation of moisture of the food product. So some of the characteristics you should look for in the packaging: vapor and moisture resistant. You want to make sure it's durable and leak proof. You don't want it to crack or break. And also easy to seal and label so that you can identify what the product is and when it was placed in the freezer. So there are several kinds of containers you'll find in your grocery store. Sealable rigid containers. They have bags and wrappings that we've seen, and also the freezer paper. These types of containers are not considered suitable for freezing, so they're going to cause the moisture to evaporate, and they can become rigid and break. Thank you. So wax paper, paper and cardboard cartons, anything that has a lid that doesn't fit well, or cottage cheese containers or yogurt containers are not recommended. And with any product you use, you want to make sure that you label and date it clearly. And you can also include the number of servings and the type of pack. So if you have it in some kind of syrup or other information. So we want to freeze the foods quickly, keep it at as low of temperature as possible, and you also want to allow adequate space. So freezers should not be overfilled with food because the air isn't going to be able to circulate and keep the products cold. So we'll make sure that the air can flow freely. Just like with canning, we want to make sure that the food is at peak freshness. Also, you want to wash it thoroughly. You want to rinse it or give it a shower, not soak it in a bath, and again, freeze quickly. Vegetables, we also want to pick at their peak freshness. You want to wash them and then blanch them. Who has blanched vegetables before? Okay. So blanching is important because it's going to help stop some of that enzyme activity. It also helps clean the surface and get rid of dirt and microbes, and it will soften or wilt the vegetables so that they fit in the package easier. If you don't blanch the products long enough, the quality is going to be compromised, and if you over blanch them, you're going to have a lot of color and nutrient loss. So you'll often see that in the water that you use, it will be colored from the vegetables. So most vegetables need to be blanched between 3 and 5 minutes. So you'll put them in boiling water, and then after they're done boiling, you'll put them in an ice bath for the same amount of time. If you look at the So Easy to Preserve or any of our publications, it will tell you how long to blanch different vegetables depending on what you're using. If you're freezing meats, these can be wrapped or rewrapped to help maintain their quality, and the shelf life depends on what product it is. So cured meats, shellfish, about 3 months, and other meats about 1 year. You can also freeze dairy foods. So milk can be frozen for 1 month, cream 3 to 4 months, and then butter up to 6 months. We do not recommend freezing these foods, and the reason is because they have a really high water content, so they're going to have really poor quality when you pull them out of the freezer. So cabbage, lettuce, celery, cucumbers, radishes, and baked or boiled potatoes. You can freeze herbs and seasonings. You need to be careful though, because some can be strong and bitter, and others may change their flavor. So just some things to think about. These are considered acceptable methods of thawing food. So my mom often thaws food on the countertop, and that is not a safe method, at least for meats or other foods that need to be refrigerated for safety. So the acceptable methods are in a refrigerator or a cooler, under cool running water, or under water that's changed every 30 minutes, or in a microwave, as long as you're going to cook the food immediately after. So just some things to keep in mind with food safety. Questions on freezing? No? Okay, and then our last method is dehydrating. And this is actually the oldest method of food preservation. It's been around for a really long time. And it's also the least expensive. So many benefits to drying foods. Also reduces the storage space, so they're very lightweight to take with you on trips. And it's going to concentrate the flavor and nutrition. So when we're dehydrating foods, we're essentially removing the water. It can be reconstituted later and to add the water back to the dry foods. The main things you want to think about are how you're going to control the temperature and the air circulation, because these will influence the quality of the product. So, who has dehydrated before? Anyone? A little bit? Okay.
I saw my mom do it.
Okay. Did she use an oven or a dehydrator? Or?
Dehydrator.
Oh, for meat. Okay. Great. So we recommend using a dehydrator or an oven. Sun or solar dehydrating is not recommended. And we'll talk about that in a second. So a dehydrator is kind of the gold standard. This is where you're going to get the best quality product because you're able to control the air circulation best. It's not going to be dependent on the weather, whereas if you're doing it by the sun or solar outside, you can't control the weather. It's also sanitary. So if you're doing sun or solar drying outside and a bird flies by and decides to drop something on your food, that's not going to be good. So, or if you have any pests or rodents. So those are other reasons why we don't recommend sun or solar drying. And a dehydrator is also going to have the quickest drying time because you're in that controlled environment. You can also dry foods in the oven. You need to check though to see if your oven setting goes to 140 degrees. This is pretty low and some ovens may not be able to maintain that temperature. Also, the door needs to be ajar 2 to 4 inches. So if you have pets or little kids running around, that's probably not going to be a good idea to have a hot oven and food being processed in there. So just some things to think about if you're going to dry in the oven. It is advantageous though because most people already have an oven, so you don't need to buy a special piece of equipment. It does take 2 to 3 times longer though than a dehydrator. So I dehydrated some bananas and that took about 6 hours. So that would take about 18 hours in an oven, which is quite a bit of time. You also need to rotate or turn the food, and it's going to be darker and more brittle than in a dehydrator, so the quality isn't going to be quite as good. So what kinds of foods can you dehydrate? As you can see, apples, cherries, grapes, peaches, pears, plums, and bananas. The ones we don't recommend are foods with a higher water content. They're not going to dry out as well, so we don't suggest trying to dry those. And then if you have any bruised or overripe fruit that you can't use for canning or freezing, that would be great to turn into fruit leather. So that's one thing that you can do. Just mix the fruit in a blender till it's like a smoothie. And then if you have a dehydrator, you can use one of these trays. spray it with some cooking oil and then, or some cooking spray, and then pour it on here, and then dehydrate it, and then you can roll it up and use it as fruit leather. So vegetables, same thing. Lettuce and radishes have a lot of water in them, so they're not going to dehydrate very well. You can also dehydrate herbs in a dehydrator, or actually even in a microwave oven. So that's another option as well. And then you mentioned meat. So you can dehydrate meat as well. You should use lean meat, and then it should be pre-treated either using a marinade, brine, or a hot pickle cure. So there will be recipes for that in some of our publications, well, which is right there. Okay. So just kind of in review, you always want to make sure that you're using USDA approved and tested recipes to make sure that you're consuming safe products. So avoid any old recipes, cookbooks, or manuals that have been outdated, or recipes that are from non-credible sources. So here's a list of our reliable resources that we recommend. Oops. Oh, and I do have someone who has some canning supplies, so if you're interested in getting any of these, I'll give you her contact information. What questions do you guys have? Yes?
What's fruit leather?
Fruit leather, it's just a mixture of fruit, and then you just pour it onto the tray and then let it dry. It's just mashed up fruit, essentially.
Do you eat it?
Yeah.
You don't actually use it to for other fruits around because it's leather. So.
Oh yeah, it's kind of like beef jerky but for fruit. Yep.